How are you? Welcome today. My name's Cam Laurie. When I was actually trying to work out my why of regen agriculture, I think it's important to actually try and somewhat determine what is regenerative agriculture, because it's very difficult to probably to actually define, and I think that's probably one of the reasons. Well, it's actually a good thing. So, regenerative agriculture is a holistic school of thought. So it's all about inclusiveness. There's absolutely no right or wrong. This is my experience. It's my opinion, obviously. It's about working with the multiple natural systems towards positive, productive outcome. So one of the things I was actually noting before was that, and it's very obvious from what Andrew was saying, is it's all about having an ecological literacy. So he was dealing with bringing his experience and knowledge from the West and coming to a new environment, but working out what worked with the environment, what was needing to happen. And one of the things he realised that needed to happen was to slow the flow of the water. That was a lot of water was hitting his landscape, slow it down so that he could actually then utilise it over the period of time and make his country more resilient, I suppose, for when it was dry as well. It actually requires you to actually look at things a little differently. Where do you start? My experience, it doesn't really matter where you start, but there are many ways to begin. It requires your management of the complex and interrelating systems. So, as I said before, ecological literacy. You need to actually develop an ecological literacy so that you can actually understand the effects of your management decisions on the ecology that you're managing, because you essentially are managing an ecology. First step's often the hardest and the easiest. So when I was first starting, I was one of the ones up the back with my arms locked like this. Oh, we can't do that round here. I was sitting with Judy Earle and Christine Jones, and we don't do that round here. And I've since realised that was the first step, was to essentially to change my mind, was the first step a lot of the time. You seek to minimise harm on those natural systems that we're working with. Remember that they've evolved over many millennia, and they're probably a lot more efficient than we are, or what we could imagine we can do. Stop being a dominator of your landscape. It's we like to dominate things. That's actually a human condition. We like to come in and be in charge of everything. We're actually not in charge of anything. It's an illusion. So allow nature to nurture and work with nature is a good point, I think. Use your intuition. I think that's really important. Intellectually trying to think something through often ends up with you not doing the right thing. Using your gut feeling. If it feels right, do it. If it smells right, go for it. What are the potential benefits? We come from a fairly big plot property and with cattle, and we get a lot of people telling us, oh, you can't do that because of this and you can't do that because of that. But the potential benefits are probably, and some of them aren't even realised as yet. You can potentially have the reduced input costs, because you don't go and necessarily have to buy a heap of fertiliser. I still buy fertiliser, but it may or may not be the expensive stuff, and you're not locked into the production cycles possibly that you need to be in industrial ag. You can become a price setter. I'm not necessarily saying that those pathways are all in place yet. You certainly have greater control over your day-to-day running. You can become a producer of healthier food, and that's actually something I'm really passionate about. I want to be a primary health giver as opposed to just a producer of food that's not necessarily giving good health. You can welcome a lot more biodiversity, and I must admit it's something that more and more on our farms we're seeing more birds, more quail. My God, the quail this year, they're ridiculous. And it's really lovely to have that magic, to share your environment with other beings, animals and bugs and whatnots. You can build carbon credits. Now this is actually an interesting point, because there's been a fair bit of negative press on the carbon credit things, I think. The current carbon emission calculator says that you can't build carbon credits in your soil based upon some science that dates back to 2010. But this week there's been four 4 properties, in 3 in Queensland and 1 in New South Wales, issued with their CCUs, their first CCUs. So it is possible. It's happening and it's being done. So people are able to get deep carbon right down to great depths in their soil, and it's non-labile carbon, so it doesn't necessarily volatilise the first time you get a drought. It doesn't necessarily burn when the bushfire goes over the top. And so the people, they're able to be paid for that or put it on their balance sheet, which is what I would prefer to do, but that's just my opinion. So you can open up new markets for your produce, which I did say that before a bit, So my journey, Cam Laurie, 5th generation cattle farmer from Gloucester area. My family and I manage 550 cows. And we're a breeder fattener operation. We have bought country at over at Tamworth as well, so we fatten cattle over there. I had a heart attack in 2007 at the age of 39, which probably started me upon the. I was an industrial designer first, and then I came back to the farm, and then I was soldiering away being a farmer, and having a heart attack probably made me think about, well, what am I doing? What's the whole purpose of this? And I think you do question a lot of things in your life. And then synergies start to happen to you. Listening to the Country Hour, I heard Elaine Ingham talking about drought-proofing your property. I thought, oh, this sounds like a good idea. And I think I may have been after I'd actually sat in the back row and been the one that Christine Jones still thinks was that annoying bastard up the back. Nothing's changed. So then the Country Hour with Elaine Ingham, so I went and did was it a 2-week course? I think it was a 2-week course at the Soil Food Web in Lismore, and it was Elaine actually running it in those days. Really fascinating stuff, and I came back very, very excited and made my first compost tea, made a brewer actually, because she showed us how to do it. No, of course, I'm pretty ingenious about that sort of thing. So I made my own brewer, made compost tea and sprayed it out, and had an immediate result. 12 hours later, you could see a green line in this paddock, which had been actually washed a little bit like we'd seeded it, and it had actually been drowned by a heap of rain. And I sprayed the compost tea out, and there's this green line all around the edge of the first line, which was pure compost tea. It wasn't even watered down. And then so I thought, oh, that's great. My 1,000 litres had not gone very far around the outside of the paddock. So I then made another brew, didn't clean the brewer because I didn't know anything about cleaning brewers. And the second brew was as good as the first. And so I suppose it was a pretty good lesson really in the complexities of things that you're dealing with, because they're very complex systems. It's a human condition to try and simplify things, but anyway, along the road, I've gone to different training things, and people would be talking to me about, oh, have you done HR? And I said, HR, and I basically didn't know anything about it. So once again, I think holistic resource management, which HRM, I was offered a course locally by Brian Welberg, which I did in Wingham back in 2009, and it was, of course, Alan. This based upon the thoughts of Alan Savoury and and his mate, Glenn, what's the other bloke's name? Parsons, yeah, Taree, yeah. And anyway, so I enrolled in the course, and it was an absolute revelation. Really, it's a lot of it is about problem solving, about peeling back the layers of the onion until you actually find out the why of a problem as opposed to the what is the problem. Because a lot of the time we look at what the problem is as opposed to why we're having the problem. And I think that was a really amazing thing. It actually started me along the path to be able to determine, because before then I was actually thinking, oh, well, this putting out biologicals is the way to go. I'd been spraying compost extracts, compost teas, putting on composts and so on. But what I hadn't realised was that I had just replaced my high input industrial agriculture with a high input biological one. So I still had to put my inputs in on all the time. I hadn't taken responsibility for the effects of my management decisions, which had actually caused the problems in the first place. Holistic management did help me do that. So I used to, as I said, look for reasons why I couldn't do things, and now ask me why I shouldn't. Really, that was what holistic management did. It taught me to keep an eye on the big picture. So we, as I said, we try to deconstruct things into the simplest possible things. It is a human condition. We try to get it so we can manage them. And science is doing it all the time. I'll go into that later, but the world's not made up of separate small systems. We live in a very complex, everything's interconnected. So to look at pests as weeds as a problem is to miss the things they're trying to tell you. They have a message to tell you. So why are they there, and what has made them happen? What's made them prosper? And even, as I said, to concentrate on a problem, on a pest as a problem, is to keep experiencing it. Actually, though, it probably helps that you just change your mindset about things a bit. Giant Parramatta grass is a good case in point. I'm using the Niagara Sporer, and I really don't actually look at it very much. It's still there. I don't worry about it anymore, and once I don't feel that it's a problem anymore, because it's no longer a weed to me, because I'm not worrying about it. And maybe that's just a perception thing, I'm not sure. So question everything, which is another thing that HR teachers should do. Just because it's been done like that in the past doesn't make it right. And as I said, science is often manipulated to actually ask a particular question so it gets a particular answer. And that creates that oversimplification creates a factoid. I call it a factoid, which is like a mutant fact which has got no relevance in the real world. And it's so often the case. For instance, the factoid that actually came out of science, they did some regenerative practices to find out about increasing soil carbon. The two practices they used, one was controlled traffic farming, this is in 2010, done in Condobolin, also quite a very brittle environment, meaning a dry environment. And the other was chemical fallow. They were the only practices they used. They didn't use many others. They saw a massive increase in soil carbon in the first 3 years, and then, because they'd also had a massive increase in their bacterial, in the soils, bacterial ratio, they saw a big decline, and it actually went back behind where it started. And it's the factoid that is currently being used to dispute that soil carbon can be sequestered. So that's why I say be careful. Don't get caught up in the science. We are practitioners of the noble and ancient art of farming. If it works, let science catch up later. And often the best way to determine an effect is the trial and error. It's actually the only way to do it.
That is science.
Yeah, it is. Science is literally, if you look up, the actual thing of science is to look and learn. And so if you actually ask the question differently, then... So what do you need to do to be a regen farmer? You need to have the right intention. So intention does affect your outcomes. Anyway, more on that later. You can ask me questions about that. You need to be passionate. Be passionate and proud of producing good, health-giving food. Your passion ignites passion in your peers and ignites passion in your people come after you. As farmers, we actually have a responsibility, I believe, to make our profession aspirational. Our children should aspire to be farmers, not aspire to be a lawyer or whatever. We should put doctors out of business because we're giving health. They're in the business they're not actually, they're in the illness business, not in the health business. We need to be agile. We've got to be, particularly in our current conditions, we're getting more and more changeable climate. We need to be mentally agile to cope with all the things that are thrown up, including our failures, because trial and error, we're going to have failures, plenty of those. And learn from them. Learn from your failures. So what works? A change to rotational grazing is actually, when I was first starting and putting all my biology out, and I went to Tim Wright's property, and I said, so Tim, why aren't you spraying out biology? And he said, he looked at me as if I'd come from another planet. He said, well, I don't need to. I use barbed wire and poly pipe. And I thought, oh, he's a very silly man. That was before I did my HR. And so I learned about the rotational grazing, and the results are quite extraordinary. In our environment, in our wet environment, relatively wet, I'm not as wet as Bulahdelah, but we can really make some massive differences very, very quickly. Probably 100% increase in stocking rates I'm seeing. So we had paddocks that have literally 100% increase, and they're doing it a lot better than they used to. Limit use of chemicals. So I think there's ways to actually, we still use chemicals on, obviously we have blackberries, we deal with those. We use less because we now use drones to apply them because that's the most cost-effective way to do so. But be aware of the effect of chemicals. I think Roundup in particular has some hideous effect. It's a very powerful chelating agent, so it ties up. Our soils are pretty poor in micronutrients because of most of them being leached out by high rainfalls. Roundup ties them up even further. That's essentially how Roundup is complexed out of the system, is that it actually ties up micronutrients. It's a chelating agent. So I rarely use it, actually. Biological enhancements. So you can get biological enhancements that actually are mixed with some of your chemicals. You can use ones that you don't use with the chemicals, and I use as many as are available, basically. And I'm very agnostic about which is good. Some are better than others, but I'm not going to sell anyone's. I do use Lee's Biocast, though, having said that. I feed or fertilise your soil organisms rather than your plants, because the plants actually are fed by the soil organisms. Plants give away sugars, the sugars out of their roots to the soil organisms in return solubilise insoluble soil and turn it into what they need to use. It's a very different system to soluble fertiliser. Try to identify what problem weeds are telling us. Yep. Think about being a grass farmer, or not necessarily grass. It can be. I be a farmer of all sorts of things because I don't want to just eat grass. I want biodiversity. Try to maintain ground cover at all times. The ground needs to be. It's the blanket for the soil. You've got to keep your bugs happy. So what doesn't work? Just quickly run through those. Poorly managed animal grazing. So there's actually a bit of bad press for grazing management, and it's time-controlled grazing. People just think they're going to put them in for 5 minutes. It's not about that. You're actually grazing them not for the time. You're grazing for the feed that's there. You're grazing for what you want to encourage. Oh, and there's another thing about that too. Grazed grass grows, I think it's 3 times faster than cut grass, because the enzymes in the mouth of the animal is actually improves the growth. So misuse of chemicals, misguided genetic manipulation. So that's another one altogether, but there's I'm not going to go into that right now. Rampant use of chemical fertilisers. So the chemical fertilisers, as I was saying before, they are a soluble nutrient that is designed to be taken up by the plant's roots. In so doing, you're basically short-circuiting the whole plant feeding the soil bugs idea, and you end up with a hydroponics. So then your plant needs more soluble fertiliser. Monoculture cropping. If you want a healthy soil, you need to have, can I go backwards? Yeah. You need to actually have a lot of things to feed the healthy bugs in the soil, because they need different things to eat. Bare ground, don't have bare ground. Concentrating on problem weeds rather than, we'll get past that one. So things I've done, just quickly run through some of those. This rotational grazing, obviously, with my subscriber, 2-wire electric fencing. I've got some photos of that. Rock phosphate aerially applied, which was a bit interesting. People said it couldn't be done. It had sat on the ground for about 2 months and got wet as all hell, but it went out eventually. Compost tea, extract use, chicken manure, Boomless nozzles and soft pumps. So soft pumps are pumps that don't chop fungi up in particular. Multi-species summer, winter. Got some photos of those that might be able to show you. Crimp rollers, still in the process of investigating that. I want to be able to try and deal with Taree like we all do. I'm also thinking about making it into gin. I sent some off to a gin distiller recently to see if we can make gin out of the seeds. So we've done 14 hectares of tree lots on our property at Gloucester, which is with CFOC funding. I don't know if anyone knows Rawdon Vale. It's a big wide open valley which was settled in the 1840s, and they very zealously cleared it, and so there's not a tree from one mountain to the next. Biological GPG control. With LLS funding, we've 15 k's of fenced off waterways, and I have actually got some photos of some of the health. The waterways are extraordinarily better. We've got a lot of lamandra growing up in the creeks, and they've essentially become a stream of ponds again, as they should do, once you get the cattle away from the edges. Easy wean rings. We use those plastic rings in the noses we've got 500 or 600 of them in our circulation, because they essentially are the best way to wean, we find. More things. So donkeys. We've got donkeys to deal with the wild dogs, and actually I was interested how you deal with it at Bulahdelah with the wild dogs and the sheep, because I know there's plenty of wild dogs around. Donkeys seem to be doing a pretty good job. I've also tried biological applications topically, so I backlined with lab serum, amongst others, and compost teas, and pretty promising results in terms of the weight gains on the calves that were done that way. Low stress stock handling. We use that in the paddock, but also in the yards, and had an interesting time where we actually were talking about how the calves knew where the bale was, and the guy was working with me, and he said, "How do they know where the bale is?" And I said, "I wonder whether they're picking up my intention to catch them." And I thought, well, I'll have a think about how to do this, and I actually thought hard about how I would not think about catching them, but I thought about a passageway through the race out to the front. And he said, well, I'm not going to say what he said because it was rude. But it was extraordinary, the difference. Subtle energies, another big thing, but it's related to that sort of thing. It's essentially about using the power of your intention and thought. SIBO Labs, we've been involved in a flagship farmer thing with McDonald's, and part of that where they actually were looking at the results of what we were doing, and actually were verified by the satellite stuff, which is pretty good, interesting stuff. We use an OptiWay platform at Tamworth, which informs how our cattle are going. So if they start slowing down in their weight gains, we're able to move them on to a better paddock. We don't have a good rotational grazing setup over there yet because we're not there. So we're still probably in the high biological, we're in a high use of biologicals over there. But that's something we're aiming towards in the future. So FarmBot, we use FarmBot to remotely monitor the water over there. It's all off-stream water, all off dam water, because we have to also dose all the water in Tamworth because there's a heap of lucerne. And so we also dose them with Nutrimol on a daily basis through that as well. We've got very large cattle mobs compared to what we did have. So we had 220 cows in one mob the other day with 220, well, they didn't have 220, they had 205, I think, calves, but you're always going to have some losses, but they're like mustering plasticine, which we use dogs, and the donkeys and the dogs don't seem to worry us. The donkeys don't like the dogs, but we can get around it. Things to look out for. When you first change over, there can be a nutrient crash. And this is, people talk about it as the big bad ogre of biological ag. It's to be expected, to be honest. You've gone from you're taking a drug addict off the drug, and you're telling them to rely upon something, all the friends that they used to rely upon. Well, they don't have any friends because they haven't been feeding them for the last 20 years. So you've got to rebuild the community, the soil community. So you need to wait for it to happen. It takes patience. Look after your livestock. Try to consider those little fellas as livestock. The ones that you put out, if you're putting out biology, don't overstock. So when I first started putting compost tea on, I overstocked a buggery. I put it on straight, 100% pure compost tea. I was putting on so many organisms and they were having a party and they were eating everything in sight when they hit the ground. Needless to say, there was not enough nitrogen to grow the plants. So if you do overstock, you've still got to feed them. So you're going to have to get good at using your boom jet to spray out plenty of tuna and kelp. Act, observe and act. Working out what works for your farm is tedious. My experiences will be different to anyone else's. You need to work it out for yourself. It's never simple, but you're on the right track. Oh, greenwashing. Oh yes, well, there's plenty of greenwashing going on, and particularly within the carbon aggregation field, there's some good operators and there's some total sharks. So you're not doing it for your peers. It's about you. It's about what you want to do. It's your holistic goal, not somebody else's. What can you hope to see? Better soil structure. Worms, and not so much intestinal worms actually, more about the worms in the soil. You actually see a lot better animal health because I suppose really you're giving them fresh feed, fresh pastures, clean pastures a lot. Distinct rhizosphere. This is actually pretty cool. I've got a photo that we might get to afterwards. It's where the carbon's accumulating. More biodiversity, nutrient cycling at soil surface, ground cover. Much better ground cover, and if Chris is not here yet, well, I went to his place I was amazed to see that it was up to about your knees a few weeks ago. Some new weeds that you were so worried about will fail to prosper, and eventually they just disappear altogether. You can see results overnight. You can see, and that's, as I said, just in less than 24 hours, but doesn't necessarily mean it's sustainable. Organic soil carbon, it's probably a bigger thing, and maybe we could talk about it a bit later, labile and non-labile carbon, and particularly the stuff that CC uses should be considered, should be the non-labile, because labile carbon essentially can easily volatilise back into carbon dioxide, so you're better to look for non-labile. And you can get that in your actual soil test from EAL. So carbon farming, as I said, it's catch cry. There's third-party carbon aggregators, and look, it is a very valid second income stream for a regenerative ag person. There's also the carbon emissions scheme thing that we're doing, the ECART model, I suppose. I don't know whether many of you know, but MLA have got one, carbon calculators. Some extremely amateurish, in my opinion, assumptions being made behind a lot of that, and I think that get into it because that's the only way we're going to affect the outcomes, because currently the science is just creating an absolute lemon in my mind. Methane emissions as well. They've put a thing on the back of a cow and they say that that's the emission that's going up into the atmosphere. They don't take no notice of the fact that there's hydroxyl ions that are being emitted by healthy soils, or that there's methanotrophs in healthy soils that actually consume the methane. And the other thing is that if the grass is left to grow and decompose, it's going to create methane. Oh, funny that. So our big bogey of animals is not necessarily the bogey that's being painted. Models away from correct, but anyway, that's I get on my soapbox about such things. So thanks for listening.